Hey everyone, ready to spin into a new deep dive with us? Buckle up, because this one's going to take you for a ride. We're tackling the physics of rotation.
That's right. All things spinning, turning, and whirling through space.
And to guide us on this journey, we've got the one and only Richard Feynman, or at least his incredible lectures on physics. We're diving into Chapter 18, Rotation in Two Dimensions.
A classic. Even if physics makes your head spin, Feynman has a way of making it clear, engaging.
Almost fun, even.
Exactly.
Well,
He had this knack for starting with something so simple, so relatable, and then, bam, he hits you with this profound concept that just changes how you see the world.
Totally. Like in this chapter, he starts with this image of like chucking this wonky, lopsided object. Imagine something made of blocks and sticks, maybe some feathers glued on for good measure.
Sounds aerodynamically challenged.
Oh, right. It's all over the place, wobbling, jiggling as it flies through the air. But here's the thing. Even with all that chaos going on inside, the object itself, the whole thing together, it still moves in that perfect parabola shape. Just like a perfectly thrown baseball would.
It's kind of counterintuitive
Yeah.
when you think about it.
Totally. So how does that even work?
Well, that's where the magic of the center of mass comes in.
Center of mass. Okay, so we're not just talking about finding the middle of the object, like if you were going to cut it in half perfectly.
Not exactly. See, the center of mass, it's not just about the geometric center. It's more like, imagine you're taking into account the weight of every single atom in that object.
Okay, so it's like each tiny atom gets a vote on where the center is.
Exactly. But those votes, they're weighted. The atoms in the denser parts, the heavier parts, they have more pull, more say in where that center of mass ends up.
Gotcha. So it's like a weighted average, but for like the entire object.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. That center of mass. It always moves in a smooth, predictable way. It doesn't care about all the craziness happening inside the object.
It's like the calm in the center of the storm, watching all this chaos swirling around, but staying perfectly still.
Or, Feynman uses this great example. Picture yourself floating inside a spaceship, right? You push off one wall, you drift to the other side, maybe do a few flips and spins along the way. It feels like you're moving the entire spaceship with all that motion.
Right, like you better be careful not to throw off the trajectory by doing too many somersaults in there.
Exactly. But here's the catch. While you're busy bouncing around inside, the center of mass of that spaceship, taking you into account and everything else on board, it stays put. Those internal forces, they don't change the overall motion.
Hold on, so you're telling me all that moving around inside the spaceship, it doesn't actually change your position in space?
You got it. It's like trying to lift yourself up by your bootstraps. You can push and pull all you want, but you're not going anywhere.
That's wild. It's like the universe has these hidden rules, and we just cracked the code on one of them.
And this rule, this concept of center of mass, it gets even more intriguing when we apply it to things like rockets. Because clearly, rockets do move.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. How does a rocket actually move if it can't push off of anything out in space?
That's the beauty of it. Rocket propulsion, it's not about moving the center of mass of the rocket itself. It's about expelling mass, in this case, rocket fuel, to propel the rest of the rocket forward.
Okay, so we've got this rocket blasting off, propelled by this expulsion of mass, changing its position in space. It's already mind-blowing. But then Feynman takes us even deeper into this world of rotation, how things spin, turn, pirouette through the universe.
And this is where things get even more interesting, because real-world rotation, it's rarely as simple as a smooth spin on a fixed axis.
Right, like picture a basketball spinning on someone's fingertip. It's not perfectly still.
Exactly. It wobbles a bit.
Or think about a planet rotating in space, even Earth, right?
Yeah, there's a wobble there too.
So how do we even begin to make sense of it all when it's never that simple?
Well, Feynman, being Feynman, he introduces this concept of an ideal rigid body. It's a simplification, of course, but it helps us get to the core of rotation without getting bogged down by all the messy realities.
Okay, so it's like we're creating this perfect model in our minds, this ideal spinning object.
Exactly. With this ideal rigid body, we imagine a shape that never changes no matter what. No bending, no wobbling, no deformation, just pure rotation.
I like it. We're starting with the simplest scenario, building up our understanding.
Exactly. And by doing that, by focusing on this idealized model, we can start to ask some pretty fundamental questions, like how much does it turn and how fast?
And that's where those terms we might remember from physics class come in, right? Angular position and angular velocity.
You got it.
Honestly, those terms always sounded a bit intimidating to me, but I have a feeling Feynman can make them make sense. Oh, absolutely. Think of it this way. Remember how we describe linear motion, distance and speed? We can describe rotational motion in a similar way, just using angular position and angular velocity instead. So, angular position tells us how far an object has rotated from its starting point.
Okay, and angular velocity tells us how fast it's rotating.
Exactly. How quickly that angle is changing.
So, like, if we think about the second hand on a clock, its angular position is constantly changing as it sweeps around, and the angular velocity tells us how quickly those seconds are ticking by.
Perfect analogy.
So the faster that second hand spins, the higher its angular velocity.
You got it.
Okay, this is starting to click. But there's another piece to this puzzle, right? To actually get something spinning in the first place, to make it rotate, you need to give it a kind of push.
You're talking about torque.
Torque,
Right.
right? Like if you're trying to loosen a stubborn bolt, you need a good amount of torque to get it turning.
Exactly. Torque is that twisting force that causes rotation. And Feynman, because he loves connecting these seemingly unrelated ideas, links this concept of torque to the idea of work.
Because in a way, making something turn, making it rotate, it does require work. It requires effort.
So like when I'm struggling to open a pickle jar, I'm basically in this epic battle of torque with the lid.
Pretty much.
And the amount of work I put in, how much effort, it all comes down to how much torque I can create.
Exactly. And this is where another term comes into play. The lever arm. It's something Feynman emphasizes when he's explaining torque.
Lever arm. Okay, that one's a little fuzzy for me. Can we break that down? Lever arm. It sounds like a physics test question waiting to happen.
It does, doesn't it? But it's actually a pretty simple idea when you break it down. Remember that pickle jar you're battling with?
Oh, yeah, my nemesis.
If you're just using your bare hand, you're probably not going to get very far. But now, imagine you grab a wrench, or even just a longer spoon. Suddenly it's a much easier fight, right?
Okay, yeah, I see where you're going with this.
That right there.
Yeah.
That's the power of the lever arm.
So the lever arm is basically the distance between where I'm applying the force, like my hand on the wrench, and the center of that pickle jar lid.
Exactly. The axis of rotation. And that distance makes all the difference.
So a longer lever arm gives you more leverage, which means more turning power, with the same amount of effort from me.
Exactly. It's why a longer wrench can loosen a tougher bolt, or why door handles are placed far from the hinges. It's all about maximizing that lever arm to get the most torque.
So if I try to push a door open right at the hinge, it's going to take a lot more force.
Exactly. You're basically reducing the lever arm to almost zero. So even if you push with all your might, you're not going to generate much torque. The laws of physics are working against you.
Okay, this is all making so much sense now. So we've got torque, the force that sets things spinning, and the lever arm, which can either amplify or diminish that force depending on where it's applied. But then there's this other factor, right? How do we account for an object's resistance to changes in that spinning motion? That's where angular momentum comes into play.
Precisely. Think back to when we talked about linear momentum, an object's tendency to keep moving in a straight line.
Right, like if you roll a bowling ball, it wants to keep rolling.
Exactly. Angular momentum is like its rotational counterpart. It's a measure of an object's tendency to keep spinning the way it is.
So a spinning top has angular momentum, and that's why it seems to almost resist our attempts to nudge it off balance.
Exactly. And just like with torque, the distribution of mass plays a huge role. Angular momentum isn't just about how much mass an object has, but how that mass is spread out relative to the axis of rotation.
Right, which is where that cool example Feynman uses comes in the weighted rod. The one that's much easier to spin when the weights are close to the center, but gets tougher when those weights are farther out.
You got it. And that's all because of something called the moment of inertia.
Moment of inertia. All right, break that one down for me too.
Think of it as the rotational equivalent of mass. With linear motion, a heavier object is harder to accelerate. It's got more inertia, right?
Makes sense.
Well, with rotational motion, an object with its mass spread out farther from the axis of rotation, it's harder to get it spinning, to speed it up, or to slow it down. It has a higher moment of inertia.
So something with a higher moment of inertia is kind of like that heavier object. It's more resistant to changes in its spin.
Perfect analogy. And this leads us to one of the most beautiful, mind-blowing concepts in physics, the conservation of angular momentum.
Okay, hit me with it. I'm ready.
So here's the deal. If there are no external torques acting on a system, and this system could be anything, a spinning top, a figure skater, even the entire solar system.
Whoa.
If there are no external torques, the total angular momentum of that system, Stays the same. It's constant.
So it's like the universe has this rule no matter what kind of internal gymnastics a spinning object might be doing, that total angular momentum must always balance out.
Exactly. And this law, it's everywhere. Think about those incredible figure skaters who can spin so fast just by pulling their arms in.
It's mesmerizing. How do they do
Yeah.
that?
They're changing their moment of inertia. By pulling their arms in, they decrease their moment of inertia. And because their total angular momentum has to stay constant, their spin speed increases to compensate.
That is incredible. It's like physics meets art.
It really is. And that law, that principle, it's at work all around us, constantly. It shapes the movement of everything from planets and stars to that mesmerizing spinning top.
Wow. We started with a wonky object flying through the air and ended up exploring this fundamental law that governs the entire universe. That's the Feynman effect in action.
He had a way of opening our eyes to the connections that are all around us.
He really did. And now, I don't know about you, but I'm seeing those connections everywhere. In the spin of a basketball, the twirl of a dancer, even just a simple top spinning on a table. It's like Feynman handed us this secret decoder ring for the universe. So next time you see something spinning, take a moment. Think about the forces at play, the conservation of angular momentum. You might be surprised by what you discover. Until next time, keep those brains spinning.